Hi, this is Kim Shanley of Tennis Reach. First, I want to wish all of you a Happy New Year. And secondly, I wanted to explain why I haven't been on the channel too much lately. I've had a few surgeries, relatively minor over the last few months, but it did take me out of action for a while. Now, I put the time to good use, I think, in researching some of the principles and ideas that we're going to talk about in the coming year, including the Federer Paradigm series that we're on now. I wanted to make sure that what I'm telling you about tennis is consistent with what the best coaches and minds are thinking about in the other sports that are similar to tennis in terms of swinging, golf, baseball in particular. So I've said this repeatedly, that it's important for us within the tennis domain not to stay within that silo, to look at the best ideas and the best coaches, what they're saying in other sports, and to see if the universal dynamics of movement that underlie all action in sports are consistent, and that we're really saying the proper things about speed, power, kinetic chain, etc. So you'll notice this first lesson, I'm beginning not with a tennis racket in my hand, but with this 6-foot bullwhip. I really think the whip and learning how to use a whip could be one of the first teaching tools for coaches, as it tells us several important principles about how we generate power and real speed in this tennis swing and stroke. It's not what we think, and it takes a whole different kind of mindset in order to learn how to crack the whip. Now, after this lesson, if you decide to go out and buy a whip, be sure that you wear safety goggles when you're first starting. This tail end of this whip goes very fast, and it could injure your eye or ear or something like that at first if you're not careful. So first, an amazing fact about the whip. The whip's been around for thousands of years, but until the 20th century, this was the fastest man-made object. So when you crack a whip, the end of the whip exceeds the sound barrier and creates a little sonic boom or crack. That's over 767 miles an hour. So it's pretty amazing with a slow, languid action, which I'll show you in a minute, that we can make an object move faster than the sound barrier. So a few cracks first. Just the basic crack, which is called the Cattleman's crack. Let's take a quick look at the components of the whip. So we have the handle here, which is the thick, stiffer part of the whip. We have a tapered thong, leather of some other materials, tapers down. And then the third section is the flail, again, even more tapered. And finally, we have the cracker, which is the part of the whip that goes over 767 miles an hour. So what the heck does this have to do with playing tennis in the Roger Federer Forehand paradigm? Well, the key action in the stroke is the swing, and the key main action in the swing is this release at the end, this cracking of the whip, as I call it, and other people have called it. So if I were simulating a tennis stroke with a whip, I might start down here like in the ready position that Federer has. I'd be taking the whip back, and then just like Federer, he drives the arm out to the side, not towards the target, but out to the side, and the racket then is about here when he starts to release the lag, which creates the snapping through of the racket at very high speeds. So a very important lesson to learn about the Federer forehand paradigm is that at its core, it's a whip-like action. So the body essentially is the stiffer handle of the whip. Our arms are the tapered thong. Get down to the hands and the fingers as the thong. And then finally, at the end of our fingers, of course, in our hand, is the racket, which is like the cracker. Now, the analogy breaks down a little in the sense that the tennis racket isn't, while it's flexible, it doesn't have that loose wave-like form as the whip cracker, but the principle is the same. So we take the racket back, we're generating this tremendous kind of wave form, and then at the end, this snaps through. So all of this action is the slow preparatory action like we do with the wave of the whip, sending the wave forward down to the outside. But from right here to contact is over 60% of the speed of the tennis swing. So just like the end of the cracker of the whip is by far faster than any part, 30 times faster than any part of the other form or other wave part. That last motion has tremendous acceleration and speed in it if done properly. So taken as a whole, the whip and the Federer forehand have these common characteristics of a slow take back, slow wind up, form, rhythm, then with a fast snapping action at the end. Now, is what I'm saying consistent with how other sports think of the tremendous release of speed during the swing? And in fact, they're almost exactly the same. So in golf, for example, we have a setup just like we have in tennis, and we also have this slow take back and start slowly accelerating into the swing. But right here is where we have the crack of the whip in the golf swing. From here to contact, a very relatively short amount of space. But in this is over 60% of the overall golf swing. The same in baseball, where the swing starts with some kind of take back, usually push back of the bat into a slotted rotation, and then the batter drives into it, starting to turn the bat, but right about here we get to the crack of the whip of the bat. And from here to contact is over 60% of the speed, bat speed that we get into contact. And so over 60% of the power happens right at the end with the crack of the whip. So given the nature of the whip-like action of the stroke, the first important lesson is that we don't try to put power and force into our motion too soon. So all the advice about getting ready too soon, load and explode, tense your body because you want to have a fast action at the end is incorrect. You see Federer, he has a nice, slow, languid motion, and everything builds in speed and sequence in the kinetic chain all the way to the end. But at the end, then there's really an explosion of speed at the crack of the whip. And so we have to start doing everything with that overall dynamic in mind. The second lesson of the whip is that we need a loose, relaxed body and hand to execute the whip properly. If we're too rigid with that whip, it's not going to create the waveform that we want and not have the rhythm and free release of the racket that we want at the end. So in the martial arts, again, we look outside of other sports to see what they have to offer us. And they have a term for this, it's called Tsung, which means a loose but energized body and a kind of a whippy, wave-like form, but not droopy and de-energized. So we want to be energized, but we want to be loose and whippy. And that's another important principle for us to embed in all of our learning and teaching about the Federer forehand and tennis in general. The third lesson of the whip is that we must have a certain form to generate the speed and action that we want at the end of the stroke. So these kind of straightforward, linear, to the target kind of swinging actions which we see with most tennis players are not consistent with the whip principles. Rather, we see loopy curls and loading and unloading and waggles and this sort of snake-like form at the end. And that's what we want to concentrate on as we develop our stroke. A certain form for our takebacks and for the racket and for the motion of the racket through contact. We don't want this straight swinging gait action towards the target that we see so often that ruins so many strokes. The fourth lesson of the whip is that we need a certain rhythm to create the cracking of the whip. And so this waveform that we begin and follow through on starts kind of in slow motion and gradually speeds up as the kinetic chain speeds up into this crescendo at the end. And so we have to think about the sequencing of how we're moving our body from slow and faster as we move out to the end of the swing. The fifth lesson of the whip is there has to be a certain timing to the crack of the whip. So we're not just going at the same speed and going faster and faster. That's not going to produce the crack of the whip. Also, there has to be an acceleration and deacceleration throughout this process so that as we're moving our bodies through, yes, every part starts to get faster at the end, but before we get to the end of one motion, the speed is passed along to the next sequence in the kinetic chain. So we take back and the hips start to move first, and then the arm, and then the chest, and then the hand, and then the release of the racket. So that all has to be timed. And really at the end of this, you see this use of the non-dominant hand with all the Federer strokes and all the great players, is there's sort of a bracing or stabilizing part where we don't keep turning the body in rotation. We're deaccelerating here, stopping and stabilizing so that this last part can go through quickly. And so that becomes the key to understanding the dynamic of the whip, is that there's a moment of stopping or almost there's a moment of deceleration and stabilization of the body in order for the hand and the racket then to go through quickly. In this Federer Forehand Paradigm series, it's important not to jump instantly to the quick tip and the results component of the lesson. Much more important to understand with real clarity in your mind and your body the overview concept of what we're trying to talk about. That's going to provide so much more guidance for you and better tennis down the road than some little quick tip. But I will provide something that you could take away today with this. So in terms of, well, about the whole whip dynamic. So if you were to get warmed up here a little bit, but if you were to grab this racket, like most players do, with sort of a maximum grip, and just we'll overdo it now. So if there's a 5 is the hardest you can grab it at a 5 level. And so if we grip the racket very tightly and we take back the swing in the typical sort of split hands manner with the tip of the racket pointing to the back fence and we're trying to swing through the contact, well, it might look something like that. So I can swing pretty fast, but now reduce the grip to just barely holding on to the racket with some control. So that's maybe a 1 or a 2. And now swing your hardest with it. And you can immediately start to feel that racket release at the end in a much faster way than we can that if we grip the racket and we make this kind of a uniform swinging motion that we see. So we'll be going into a great more detail about how to create the timing, the rhythm, the form of this whip-like action in future articles. But for now, let's leave it at a search for this whip-like action for your forehand and the culmination and the crack of a whip.